Good evening, friends. Welcome to Philadelphia, my city, the city that welcomed me a long time ago, the city that welcomed this 17-year-old runaway from Boston and took me in. Now, I hope this city will take you in as well, that you'll be greeted, dined, and housed with gracious good feeling. I'm going to talk about myself this evening. Now, before you get too upset about that, it's what they've asked me to do. They've asked me to talk about myself. Now, my mother always taught me that it's impolite to only talk about myself. So I'm going to give you a chance later to talk about me as well. You are, as I understand it, a most international group. But we're accustomed to that in Philadelphia. By the time I arrived here from Boston in 1723, this was the most international and multicultural city in America, in all of North America. Thanks to the forward thinking of Philadelphia's founder, the English Quaker William Penn, we've enjoyed religious liberty since 1701 by law here in Pennsylvania. Now that was unique, not only in America, but pretty much in the rest of the world, that no one else certainly in this country, in any province in this country, had been granted the legal religious liberty to worship or not to worship as one pleased. So Philadelphia was a unique place. People came from all over Europe and all of the Americas, and from all over the world increasingly. Since many of you are from outside this country, as I understand it, perhaps I should tell you more about myself. Perhaps you are wondering, who is this man they call Benjamin Franklin? Particularly since I haven't exactly kept up with modern fashion. I was born in the year 1706, which helps to explain the way that I'm dressed. I began in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Boston was an interesting city, old by the standards of British North America, and quite provincial. From an early age, I was quite inquisitive. I began to be very curious about the world and how it worked. My father enrolled me at the age of 8 in what is now the Boston Latin School. Now, I was the 15th of 17 children, and I was the 10th son. So my father got it into his head, being a very devoutly religious man, that I was going to be his tithe to God. And so he decided that I should be a clergyman. Now, people who've known me over the years already know that might not have been the best decision to be made. He had me on a track to Harvard and in the first grade. Unfortunately, though I was a superior reader by the age of 3 or 4, I failed arithmetic in the first grade. And truth be told, I just was loving reading so much that I paid no attention to mathematics. Frankly, my father doubted my academic commitment and, of course, was pondering the financial commitment. This is a man, remember, who was a candle and soap maker with 17 children. So anything that would cause him to think about further education was certainly a financial commitment. So he removed me from that school after the first year. It was rather expensive. And he enrolled me in a less prestigious school for the second grade. Actually, I'm really certain now that there was more in his mind than that, because he could already see that I was a contentious and questioning child, and here I was in Puritan Boston. I think he thought that I would be something of a disaster as a clergyman in that narrow-thinking religious world. After completing the second year of school, at the age of 10, I had finished my formal education. This was not unusual at the time for children whose parents didn't have a lot of money, maybe had a lot of children like my parents did. It was quite common for a child who had learned to read and write to be apprenticed to a trade. Now, my father took me into his shop as his apprentice. So this meant at the age of 10, I was getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and working until 9 o'clock or so at night, making candles and soap, and generally being in a rather disgusting business. Not only that, a dangerous business. One of my predecessors, one of my father's earlier children, had actually drowned in a tub of suds in my father's shop when someone sort of lost track of where he was. So this was a dangerous, nasty business. But the worst thing about it was, here I was at after having to go to school for only 2 years, being a very, as I said, very bright, inquisitive child. I wanted to continue my education. I did not want to know only what I knew by the second grade. And so it was very distressing for me to be doing this apprenticeship with my father, knowing that by the time I got home at night, the last thing that I felt like doing was reading a book. I knew I was going to have to be up early the next morning. And so I came to my father when I was 12, and I said, "Is there something else that I can do?" He said to me, perhaps I understand that this is probably not the best work for you. Your older brother James is a printer, and I knew that. And he said, perhaps we could apprentice you to your brother James. Now, my brother, as I said, was a few years older, had what was becoming a very successful print shop, and he also published a newspaper, the New England Courant, which is also, by the way, in your time, still published today in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the oldest newspapers in the country. But he said, let's talk to your brother, see if he'll take you on as an apprentice. Now, my brother looked at me as probably most of us would look at a younger sibling with a bit of disdain and doubt as to what kind of help they might be around a business that we valued. But he took me on. Now, he agreed to take me on. But he said, your apprenticeship is going to be 9 years, because printing is a tough business to learn. This was his story. I think he was looking for free help. But because being an apprentice in those days was not just someone who went to learn how to do something. It was an indenture. You were an indentured servant. It didn't matter if it was your family. And so my brother said, you're going to work for me for 9 years, and that is till you're 21, and I will pay you when you enter the 9th year of your apprenticeship. So I could look forward to being paid in 8 years. All he had to do was give me a place to eat and a place to sleep. And he was the master of the shop, brother or not. But you know what? I was delighted. Printing was also a tough business. Working with that heavy metal type, I would be required to carry around boxes that maybe weighed 50 or 60 pounds. I had to learn how to set type backwards, all of these things. But I was delighted because what we were printing were books, newspapers, magazines, reading material. And this was the most wonderful thing to me, to be exposed to all of that education within that shop. And so I took to printing quite well. And I worked with my brother, and we got along very well for the most part. Again, older brother, younger brother, dynamics you might understand. But, and it was fine as long as I understood my place, you might say, in the shop. That I was there to do the things that he didn't want to do, didn't have time to do. And, but by the time I was 16 years old, almost 17, I started to think a little differently. I began to realize that I not only liked to read, I liked to write. And so I began to write things, and I would share them with my friends. And my friends were very encouraging. They said, you know, Benjamin, you're a wonderful writer. You know, maybe you should write something for your brother's newspaper. Now, my brother, I did propose that. I proposed writing something for my brother's newspaper. In fact, I sent him, I handed him something that was a letter to the editor. And he looked at it and just looked at me and said, you can't write for my newspaper. You're not smart enough. You're my younger brother. And besides, you have a job here and it's not writing. And so he sent me back to work. And I tried and tried, and it soon became apparent to me that James Franklin, my brother, was not going to publish anything written by Benjamin Franklin. So I did the only thing. I was rather determined, and I was a teenage boy, so I was also becoming a little arrogant. Most of that went away eventually. And so I did the only thing I could think of. Does anybody know what I did to get published? I'm sorry. I know this is a vast group. Well, I'll tell you what I did. I wrote something, a letter to the editor of my brother's newspaper, and I did not sign my own name. I created an identity. I signed this letter, Silence Do-Good. And history in your time now knows them as the Silence Do-Good letters. And most people, when I speak, especially when I speak to high school groups or something, find that a rather amusing name. But remember, this was Puritan Boston. And these were very religious, very holy people. There is no name more holy to these people than do good. And also, the silence part was very important to these men in Boston, because I must explain that I not only changed my name, I changed my age, and I changed my gender. I wrote as Mrs. Silence Do-Good, a widow, and remember, I am a not quite 17-year-old boy, and I have the presumption to think I can pull off passing myself off as a woman in her 40s and talking about all of the problems that she has. But they bought it, I have to tell you. And they kept coming into the shop after that and saying, when is that Mrs. Do-Good going to write something else? Oh, and by the way, the silence was very important, because remember, these were old Puritan men, and there was no name that befit a woman better than Silence. And so this was the situation. All of a sudden, I wrote 14 of those letters over the next 6 months. I was the most published writer in Boston. Now, the only problem was, no one knew it was me. And I'm a normal 17-year-old by that time, and I wanted to feel important, and I knew it, but no one else knew it. I hadn't even told my friends. So I finally decided that there would be no harm in telling a few of my friends. And so I told them, I told a few, that Silence Do-Good woman, that's actually me. They were a little skeptical at first, but I finally convinced them when I wrote the next piece. But I should have known, I wish I'd known what I knew a few years later. Later I wrote many things under assumed names just for effect. But the most successful thing I ever did was a series of almanacs called Poor Richard's Almanac, which I published every year for 25 years, sold every copy, made me more money than anything else I ever did. But I wish I'd known, in order to boost those sales, I began to include sayings. You may have heard some of them, things like early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A stitch in time saves 9. A fool between two lawyers is like a fish between two cats. That's one of my favorite. But I hope there are no lawyers here. But there may be. We'll talk later. But anyway, one of the sayings that I had published in there was that 3 people can keep a secret as long as 2 of them are dead. Well, none of my friends were dead. And so, as I should have known, the secret did get out. And Boston was still kind of a small community at that time. And my brother's friends began to hear the story. They told my brother, that Mrs. Do-Good is your own brother and employee, Benjamin Franklin. He didn't take it well. First of all, he was being embarrassed in front of his friends. Second, he had told me not to do this. And so he began to treat me very badly. He was the master of the shop, after all, and he could beat me when I made mistakes. He could make me work harder. And so he didn't take it well. And finally, when I had the opportunity, after he had been briefly arrested for for writing. He was a rather muckraking journalist, by the way. He began to attack the royal governor of Massachusetts and was briefly arrested. They had no protection in colonial British North America against criticizing the government at the time. And so he was arrested. And finally, I took the opportunity to, while he was distracted with all of this, to pack up my things and leave Boston. I was 17 years old. I ran off to Philadelphia, and I've been here ever since, except for 25 years in Europe, off and on. But I've been here ever since. And so this was I arrived in Philadelphia as a young runaway, as I said before, without any money, without any friends or family here. I had a rather interesting journey. Of course, you can't sail directly from Boston to Philadelphia because, as you may know, we're the only colony here of the original colonies that's not located on the ocean. But so I sailed down to New York, got on another ship, sailed down to Perth Amboy, New Jersey, walked across that skinny part of New Jersey. I was young and fit. Don't look at me now. And then I got on a small boat. We came down the Delaware River, just a few people in the boat. There was one fellow who was disgustingly drunk and fell overboard. We had to fish him out. And so when I arrived in Philadelphia, got off the boat down here at the docks, I was dirty and wet. I had a few pennies in my pocket. I stopped at a bakery down by the docks and bought some what I describe in my autobiography as large puffy rolls. I gave one to a mother and her little child, but I had the other two. I was walking up the high street, what we now call Market Street, with a roll under an arm and eating the other one with dirty socks hanging out of my pockets and all of this. And there was a young woman standing on the stoop of her house on Market Street, and she saw me and began to laugh hysterically. I like to say that I got my revenge on her. I married her eventually, but that's another story. But I got here. I was able to find work because, as was later pointed out to me, there were no really good printers in Philadelphia. I found a man with a print shop who had just lost an employee, and he hired me right away. I said I needed a place to live. He sent me over to the house of Mrs. Reed on Market Street, who had just recently lost her husband, needed to rent a room. And when I knocked on that door, it was opened by, yes, that same young woman who had laughed at me as I walked up Market Street. And so I moved into their house. And we would eventually marry after some troubles. When I was 18, after I'd been here a while, I tried to make an impression on people. I wanted to be seen as it's what you might call a go-getter, someone who is very enthusiastic. And so I began to go out of my way to, again, I'm 18 years old. I began to go out of my way not only to be busy, but to look busy. And I'm sure that you all know that sometimes the most important thing is to look busy. And so I was impressing people, and there was a man who was the lieutenant governor, lieutenant royal governor here, and he saw my work, and he said, you know, young man, you can never learn what you need to learn as a printer here in Philadelphia. You need to go to London. He said, that's the only place that's going to teach you. And so he said, I said, well, I can't go to London. I don't know anybody there. I can't do anything. He said, if you can get yourself to London, I will send you letters of credit, letters of recommendation. And so I said, all right. So I got myself to London. I sold all my books and all of this, got a one-way passage to London. I arrived there. I would end up being in London for a year and a half. And during that time, those letters of credit and those letters of recommendation never arrived. When I mentioned Governor Keith's name to someone, they said, letters of credit? He has no credit. And you don't want him recommending you because no one would trust you if he recommended you. And so I was stuck in London. But that has a wonderful sound, doesn't it? If you've been to London, being stuck in London, when you come from Philadelphia and Boston, of nothing over about 20,000 people, and you're in a city of 1 million people, it took my head away. In fact, I got so absorbed in London, I didn't even write to my young girlfriend, Deborah, back here in Philadelphia after a while, which was a problem because she kind of gave up on me. I think her mother and her friends said, he's never coming back. Why would he come back to Philadelphia? He's in London. And so a young man came along named John Rogers and sort of seduced her, and she ended up marrying him while I was away. But then, not too long after that, turned out he wasn't a very fine fellow. He was getting in trouble in bar fights and owing money to everyone, and he ran off to avoid arrest. And word came back to her that he was killed in a fight in a tavern in Jamaica. And so when I returned from London at the age of 20, after a while she did forgive me, and we ended up marrying. And I always like to say the best thing that ever happened to me was when this Mr. Rogers left the neighborhood. But what? But anyway, this was trying to catch up here. Yes, but what I came to in Philadelphia when I finally came back was a city that I had mentioned it had been founded by the English Quaker William Penn, who was a brilliant visionary. He envisioned basically a sort of United Nations in the late 17th century, a lot of innovative thinking. But the problem was Mr. Penn was a brilliant visionary, but he was a terrible businessman. He had been given all of this land called Pennsylvania by Charles II, when he sold these properties, this was still sort of under a semi-feudal system in England, so he was allowed to collect what they called quick rents, taxes from the people who owned the properties. He didn't do that. He had a manager who was defrauding him. He was here for 2 years. He had to leave to go back to London to settle with his creditors. And they even arrested him for a while and put him in debtor's prison. And he was also in trouble with the royal family because Charles II, the House of Stuart, was no longer in power, and William and Mary were, and they didn't trust him because they thought he was a Catholic spy. They all thought all the Quakers were Catholic spies. And so Penn came back here for another couple of years. But what I'm trying to say is nothing was done in Philadelphia that had been planned. Streets were laid out nicely, but they weren't paved, they weren't lit, they weren't protected, there was no police force. So when I began to start a business here, the smartest thing I did was I associated myself with another group of young tradesmen. We called ourselves the Junto. And we began to meet in the tavern once a week. That's where you met, especially when you're young. And but we began to have ideas. First of all, none of us had more than 2 or 3 years of education. So there were things that were very important to us. If we were going to have families here, if we were going to have businesses here, one of the first things we did was to start the Library Company of Philadelphia, because we had read all the books that we owned. We had read all of the books that our friends owned. And we knew that the wealthy people here had libraries, but no one was going to loan us books. And so we started the first public lending library in America, the Library Company of Philadelphia. We started a fire company. There was no organized way of putting out fires. We did not want a major fire in this city, such as it happened in London the century before, and it happened in many cities in this country. So we started the Union Fire Company. We also started a fire insurance company. We started a public hospital. I don't know if you've taken tours here, any of you, but when you do, people will say Ben Franklin started this, Ben Franklin started that, and I'm always flattered by that, but I didn't do any of that by myself. No one does. I think most of you have been around long enough to know and do what you do to know that no one does anything single-handed. But I seem to have the knack of figuring out how to get something done, even if the idea wasn't mine. 2 doctor friends came to me and said, we need a hospital here. There's not a public hospital in America. And I said, who have you talked to? They said, everybody we talked to says, have you talked to Franklin? And so I went to the assembly here, and I said, we need a hospital in Philadelphia. They said, we're not going to pay for a hospital just for Philadelphia. So I said, if we can raise half the money, will you give us the other half? And I guess I caught them off guard, and sort of a matching grant was born. They said, yes. We also started the first non-sectarian college in Philadelphia. And so this was very important to us because we wanted not only a city with promise, but we wanted to help to fulfill that promise. Now, because of all these connections, I think, I was able to build a successful printing and publishing business here. I became the most successful publisher excuse me, in America, with the largest newspaper in America. One reason I had the largest circulation newspaper in America is that along the way, I had gotten appointed by the British government as the postmaster for the North American colonies. Now that meant I had to travel around to all the colonies and help to show where roads should be built and all this. There wasn't much salary to it, but the most wonderful thing about it was that I had a franking privilege. I was able to mail things free. And so I was able to mail my newspaper everywhere in the country without paying for it. Now today you'd be locked up for that, I'm sure. But that was one of the best things about the job. So my newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, became the most popular newspaper in America. And so by the age of 42, I was very successful. I had a fair amount of money. I wasn't the richest man in Philadelphia, but I did all right. But I began to think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that inquiring mind and such, I began to be interested in other things. I started to think, you know, there's more to life than this. I was 42 years old, and this was in 1748. I had no reason to think that I would live that many more years. I mean, the average person didn't live a terribly long life at that time, unless it took really good care of oneself. And so, as it turned out, I had no way of knowing, I would be exactly halfway through my life. But I did not know that. And so I said, there's something else I want to do. I began to be interested in this new field of electricity. People were talking about it, people were playing with it. Most people were just using it to stand people's hair on end at parties or something like that. I thought that it's an important force in nature and it ought to be examined. And so I said, I need time to do that. So at the age of 42, I took in a partner and trained him in my business and turned it over to him. And I had also done that with young men in several of the other colonies, so that I had basically franchised my business by that time, and I did not have to go to the office to make a living. I began to study electricity. Excuse me, I published my findings when I discovered something. I discovered apparently the fluid theory of electricity. I coined words like current to describe the way electricity flowed. I made the first battery that anyone's ever made. Scientists tell me that my study in electricity paved the way for the discovery of the electron. And this was a man with a second-grade education. But as I said, my mind never stopped working. And so when I published my findings in electricity, they were published all over Europe. And so I was all of a sudden the most famous American. I'm using the word I a lot. I apologize for that way too much, but I'm talking about myself, which I won't do for much longer. But anyway, this allowed me it's opened up a career which I had never envisioned with my background, one of diplomacy. I was sent by the Assembly of Pennsylvania to London in the 1760s to try to overturn the Charter of Pennsylvania, which had been given to William Penn and his family in perpetuity. Penn was fine, his children were not. And so we thought we needed to get rid of that. They sent me there. I spent 15 very frustrating years in London, returned here after it being made clear to me that nothing was going to change in the British treatment of us except that they were going to make it a little more harsh. And so I returned here just before my 70th birthday in 1775. A man who had been for 70 years a British citizen, a proud British citizen. I left London, returned to Philadelphia as a revolutionary. Now, I know we have a lot of security people here. Don't be alarmed. I never engaged in terrorism or anything other than mentally terrorizing John Adams from time to time. But anyway, I did. I returned here as a revolutionary. I was sent to the Continental Congress here, where they were beginning to debate independence. Though some of the people there were skeptical because of my long affiliation with the British, I soon made it clear that I was in this fight. And I was able to to help to write and to sign the Declaration of Independence. And then something occurred to the Continental Congress. I'm sure they had thought about it before, but I know they had, in fact. But we had taken on a fight with the mightiest army and navy in the world, and we had a problem. We didn't really have an army or a navy. We had just sent George Washington off to start an army. We had no navy at all. And we knew that we needed the help of another European power. And so I was sent to Paris, again, because I was the only American that anybody knew over there. And they sent me to Paris at the end of 1776. And I made my 7th and 8th crossings of the Atlantic, going to and from Paris by that time. But we forged an alliance with the French. And eventually their help with money, with ships, with troops, helped us to finally become an independent country. And so by the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, while I was still in Paris, we had won the decisive battle in that war. Stayed there for a few more years. We finally were able to sign the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending that war officially. I returned here in 1785, and again, nearly 80 years old by the time I arrived here. And I thought I could retire. I mean, really, this is a man who at age 42 retired from business, didn't know how much longer I had, and here I am at the age of 80, and I'm thinking, maybe now I can retire. But no. In our Pennsylvania Constitution, we had decided that we did not have one all-powerful governor to govern the state, and so we had a Supreme Executive Council of 12 men to run the state. They immediately elected me to that council. The council made me the president of the council. And so I wasn't through working yet. And then, in 1787, 11 years after we had signed that Declaration of Independence, we decided that we were still not one nation. We were 13 sovereign states with no real solid mechanism under the Articles of Confederation to hold us together. I think I and a few of my colleagues had seen this years before, that we were not going to be content with being just an independent country. We wanted to be a major player on the world stage. We saw this vast continent that we sat on and knew that someday we would grow. And so we knew that we needed a constitution. We needed a document that would bind these states together a little more solidly, that we would have the resources to raise money when we needed, to defend ourselves when we needed. And so in 1787, we convened what was supposed to be the convention to reform the Articles of Confederation, but most of us had other ideas. We very quickly, that evolved into a constitutional convention. By that time, I was 81 years old. My major contributions to that, I have to say, were to try to keep people from strangling each other. It took all of my diplomatic experience to do that, but I learned, I tried to pass on what I had learned in years of negotiation, that you can't always get what you want. That ought to be a song, shouldn't it? But anyway, I am proudest of the fact that we were able to make compromises, and we were able to forge a document that was by no means perfect, and I said so at the end of that convention. But I also said it's probably the most perfect thing we could get. We were requiring that 9 of the 13 states approve this Constitution. And these are vastly different states, geographically, economically, and all sorts of things. One of the things we wanted to do, for example, was to abolish slavery. To our shame, we were not able to do that because at least 6 or 7 of those states, not only southern states, still were active in the practice of slavery. And so the genius of what we did, I think, though, was we made it possible to change it. we were smart enough to know that the attitudes would not always be the same. And so that Constitution is still in effect. I'm sorry, I'm speaking as a proud American, but it is, and it is not where we want to be yet, even in your time, I know. I have a little thing that I say to children when they ask me about the Liberty Bell. They said, "Why is it cracked?" And I said, well, they're all the usual explanations, the real explanations. But I said, I think that crack will be healed when everyone in the world is free. It's still cracked. But anyway, it's something that we were pleased to get done. I know you've had a long day here, so I'm going to wrap up. I just want to say one thing about the end of that Constitutional Convention. As I said, very near, what would be near the first phase of my life, the phase before I left and came back. But we leaving that Constitutional Convention, I made a little speech, and I won't make that whole speech now. But what I said was, General George Washington presided over that Constitutional Convention, and there was a chair that he sat in from time to time, and on the back of that chair was a sun carved, the sun on a horizon carved into that chair. And I said at the end of the convention, I said, I have many times looked at that chair and tried to decide if that sun was a rising or a setting sun. Now, I was 81, it was probably in between naps, but I said, I've tried to decide if it was a rising or a setting sun. And I said, at last I have the happiness to know that it is indeed a rising sun. We walked out of that building, a woman asked me, what kind of a government have you given us? Because we had met in secret. We did not want everything we said to be torn apart by the press. But I said, a republic, if you can keep it. And so far, so good. Thank you. Yes, sir, you have a question?
Thank you, sir. That was wonderful. In fact, we were forced in our classes to read your story, and that was very boring for me that time. But now you made it a little bit open for me. The only question that I had the time of study which was the dark side of your character had not been reported. First question is this: tell me which was the dark side that was under control and the media was not covering that one, a lot of your mistakes. And about the other part, which
now, what do you mean by the dark side, sir?
Oh, yes, I mean, everything was positive. We were so mad about all these wonderful sayings and words like don't fear the mistakes and all the other stuff. These are all the time we are repeating. But we have never heard all those dark side of your character, which was there, and you were using your power, in fact, converting, and like, for example, the other part was which you were not even going to church on Sundays, and you were staying on your own. Was there something not reported at all about your real intention?
Wait a minute, that was a dark side, not going to church?
No, I mean, just coming, a lot of things that later on came out. So tell us about your mistakes and dark sides, which really we could learn. Well, and now the last part. What if you were alive now, and how could you? Were you getting disappointed, in fact, about a system of these two Republican, Democrats, and all the other?
Oh, goodness.
Or you were turning to make it the kind of royal system which you were dreaming?
Well, I can't speak so much on things in your time because I'm not as exposed to that. But now, you don't have time for me to talk about my dark side. But I always said that there are a couple of things in my character that I've struggled against. And when I wrote, one thing I did as a young man, I decided in my 20s that I was going to try to be perfect, because I had this scientific view of the things. I said, if I did this, 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 and this, I can be perfect. And so I made a list of 12 what I called virtues, cleanliness, organization, all these things that I worked on them. I kept a little check on this, and I thought I was doing very well, but I was the only one checking on them. And I started talking to my friends about that. I said, I've got these 12 virtues, and I think I'm really improving. I think I'm really becoming a good person. And there was an old gentleman who said, he was a Quaker. He said to me, Franklin, may I suggest to thee a 13th virtue? I said, what's that? He said, humility. I'm still working on that. And I still work on vanity. And I've had the dark side. I was very much, in many ways, a product of my times. For example, through a period in my early life, I actually owned a couple of slaves in my household. That's not something I'm proud about. Something that I was persuaded eventually was wrong. In fact, I became, near the end of that period, that first period on Earth, the president of the Abolition Society of America. And I worked very hard. I wrote and I lobbied the Congress to try to get slavery outlawed and abolished. But so there are things. I was very much a human being. I still am. Tell me that last part of the question again about. About you talk about the factionalism. Yes. Fortunately, in the time that I was working here, most of our factions were personal. There is one major reason, other than historians and such, people don't give George Washington enough credit. By the strength of his leadership and his character, George Washington, during his lifetime, basically was able to prevent the country breaking up into factions and bitter parties. He kept both sides in his cabinet and sort of let them play things out. But he held the country together through a very difficult war. He held he held the army together. He held the country together during his presidency. And it will not be until he leaves the scene that I can only know this. This is a little after my time slightly, but there's an election in 1800 where John Adams and Thomas Jefferson run against each other. That is the first bitterly partisan election in America. I mean, it had to happen eventually, I'm sure. From what I hear, I would hope that people at some point decide to focus on the real problems in the world and in this country and talk about those things and give people some choices. But that's all I could say. Yes? Young man.
Bernhard Altersberger from Germany. Thank you very much for taking us forward into history. Within the Beltway, there are quite a few people saying they exactly know how the founding fathers have to be interpreted when they wrote the Constitution. Now I have a chance to speak to you. When you look back, what would you have done differently on the Constitution if you could?
Honestly, I wrote I wrote a speech about this, as I said at the end of the convention. I said I gave the speech. I didn't. I was, by that time, not in the best of health, and I actually, at the last minute, my fellow delegate, James Wilson from Pennsylvania, read the speech for me. But basically, I said we had people gathered here with all of their various talents and brilliant minds, but also all of their regional interests, their prejudices, all of these things. What I said was from such a gathering, kind of perfect production being expected, and I still say no. I'm not sure that we could have done much differently at that point. As I said, the only thing that we did was make it possible to change it. I mean, we were making this whole thing up as we went along. Almost every country in the world was governed by a sovereign, a monarch. We were looking for something new, and it wasn't completely new. We based it a lot. It sort of reflected the British system still, in a different way. Instead of a king, we had a president. Instead of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, we had a House of Representatives and a Senate. And what a lot of people don't realize now is that Senate was intended by a lot of people to be like the House of Lords, to be for very special people. It wasn't even elected by the people in the beginning. We got what we could get. I honestly think we got what we could get at the time. And I think you have to judge people and their deeds and their accomplishments by the climate in which they live. And so I don't think we can expect perfection or anything near. So I think that's all I can say on that. I consider myself not a historian, but a serious student of history, and I defer sometimes to my colleagues who are esteemed historians, but in my understanding and in my reflection on that, I would say that it's probably not productive to try to go back and say, what more could we have done? As I said, we had to get 13 very, very diverse bodies of people. Even within those 13 states, there was such a difference of opinion. So I think that our task is not to look at the past, but to see what we can do to keep fixing things. Yes, sir.
Portraits of you were very popular in Paris, that people actually bought them. You became a sensation in France, and you became America's face.
Yes.
So how were you able to achieve that success in Paris? How did you crack that code of French society? That's the first question. Second question is, since you were America's lobbyist in Paris and got substantial assistance for the revolutionaries here, do you think that in the same vein, America today should extend the same type of assistance to nations seeking similar freedoms? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the first part.
Because some people argue that America should not police the world. So what do you think about that?
Well, I don't suppose we can police the world. Certainly, I think, but I'll get back to that in a second. Going back to your initial question, yes, I appeared to be, as I said, this was a very young country. From my things that were published there, I was the only American they knew many times. And I certainly, I have been accused of lots of things in my time by my conduct with women and all this sort of thing in Paris, most of which has been exaggerated. I was, again, in my 70s, approaching 80 at the time. I had not invented any pharmaceutical enhancements or anything among my inventions. But I was unusual among men at the time in that I truly liked women. Most men didn't really care much for women at that time. I did like women. I associated with women young and old. And but I also, because I had been so engaged in scientific pursuits, I was able to be welcomed into the circles of the intellectual community there, but I also was there with the portfolio from the Continental Congress in America, and had access to the politics. You talk about my being the face of America, and you talk about my face here and my face here. They struck medals with my face on it. Some of them who'd never seen me. They did portraits. There's one place where, if you're going to get the face of America, the most interesting place where the face of America was, King Louis XVI was so jealous of the attention I was getting sometimes. He had his court potter or whatever make a chamber pot with my picture in the bottom. So that was a very distinct place for the face of America to be. But I was rather amused by that when they told me about it. I think he thought I would be insulted, but I thought, you know what they say, any publicity is good publicity. I certainly think that a country has to take care of its own interests and its own needs, and goodness knows that this country has many, many problems. But I don't know. I can't speak too much beyond that. I would just certainly say, again, from my work in the 18th century, I also know that no country, well, I was going to say no country is an island, but Britain is and all of this, you know. But seriously, one is, you are never, even increasingly so, you are never isolated from the rest of the world, no matter what you think. So certainly I suppose that you just have to have some kind of a balance, and no one will ever, one person will never agree with another, I suppose, on what that balance should be. And I can't solve it. You got to keep working on it. Anybody else? Oh, yes. Oh, why is it like this? I think he's already asked. Yes. The gentleman asked me why my hat is shaped like this. It's the tricorn hat, the tri-cornered hat. There are a lot of theories on that. Basically, I like to look at it from what I understand. The hat is round if you take it apart, if you take the sides down, and I'm sure it was originally round. One part of the evolution of the hat was a side would be turned up by a soldier, so they wouldn't knock their hat off every time they shouldered their weapons. And sailors seemed to find that the tricornered hat worked best on ship. It wasn't as liable to be blown about. I like to, in the design world, they call that form follows function. And I think that it is a product, most of all, of its function. There have been people who tried to say it signifies the Trinity and all sorts of things, but I don't think most people went around giving religious significance to their hats. It's function. And most people who, in your day, if I may get into your day, most people who wear baseball caps don't play baseball, but originally that's what it was designed for. By the late 18th century, this is simply the height of fashion. Interestingly enough, as time goes on, when the fashions change, the people wearing hats like this are the servants. So anyway, that's all I can say on that.